Welcome back. We're moving on to the final session of the day, the pathway to net zero, with a fireside chat where Robert Johnston from the Eurasia Group will be in conversation with Ivan Vella, Chief Executive, Aluminium, Rio Tinto, and the Honourable Jonathan Wilkinson, Canada's Minister of Natural Resources. Before we begin, we're pleased to remind our viewers that this session has a live Q&A component in Whova following the opening comments. It is now my pleasure to introduce Robert Johnston.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's Robert Johnston here. I'm the Managing Director for Energy, Climate, and Resources at Eurasia Group. It's been my pleasure to work with both Rio Tinto and NRCan for many years as a consultant, and I appreciate the chance to be with Minister Wilkinson and Ivan here today. So, Mr. Wilkinson, we had a great speech from you. We heard your bio. I just want to briefly introduce Ivan as well, as not everybody may know him. But Ivan is the Chief Executive for Rio Tinto Aluminium. He was appointed to that role in 2021. Prior to that, he was working in interim Chief Executive role for iron ore and previously in the copper group as well. He spent time 4 years as Managing Director for rail, port, and core services for iron ore and was responsible for end-to-end supply chain, moving iron ore from Rio's 16 mines across Australia through the rail network and onto customers. And I think supply chain is going to be a hot topic in our conversation today, Ivan, by the way. Prior to joining the iron ore business, Ivan was a COO for Rio Tinto's former coal business and had also worked with their copper business in Mongolia as Chief Operating Officer, and before that with Deloitte. So obviously between Ivan and Mr. Wilkinson, we've got some real expertise here today and lots of hot topics to discuss. I'm going to ask a few questions and we'll have some discussion, and then I'll turn to some of the questions from the audience as well. So, Minister Wilkinson, thanks for joining us. And if I could start with you, I'm just going to jump right in with a tough question I know a lot of people are thinking about after hearing your speech, which was excellent. You talked about the possibilities and potential right at the end of your speech, which I completely agree with, that Canada is very well positioned to take advantage of a lot of these favorable global trends around climate change and energy transition. I guess the question is, how do we turn those possibilities into action? Right? Do we have our regulatory framework the right way so that companies, investors have the certainty that they need? And your government has done a lot of work in this area on impact assessment. And I guess the question is, what's the right balance between the need for very thorough and thoughtful impact assessment and then a regulatory model that is competitive around the world? I know this is a question your government is dealing with over the last few years, so I'll start with that one.
Yeah, it's an important question, and certainly embedded in your question are probably a few questions around. Certainty is broader than simply regulatory processes, obviously, but I would say if the focus is specifically on regulatory processes, there's a number of things that you can do. I mean, first of all, the Impact Assessment Act that was brought in was actually intended to expedite processes. And that was what about, for example, the early piece of that process is really about aligning and identifying issues of concern that will actually facilitate a quicker process. But I do think that there is more that we can do to be thoughtful about how we avoid some of the challenges very early on in the process, such that we actually can expedite it. I think there's a broader issue as well between federal and provincial governments. There are a bunch of different regulatory pieces, not just environmental assessment in the federal level, and there's certainly a number of those relating to mining in particular, but oil and gas as well, in the provincial level. And there's an important point for us to actually work together between feds and provinces to see how you can actually align these for the purpose of expediting. And I would say, there's often a view that there are large differences between the federal government and some provinces and territories. But on the economic opportunity side of things, I don't actually think that's true. I mean, you take Alberta, for an example. They have focused on hydrogen and on biofuels and on carbon capture and on a range of those kinds of things, exactly critical minerals, exactly the same things that the federal government is focused on. So I think there's an opportunity for us to actually sit down and have a constructive, thoughtful conversation about how we expedite things, how we streamline regulatory processes, how we actually manage investments in a manner that actually ensures that we get maximum bang for the resources that we're both bringing to the table, and how we actually crowd in private sector capital and bring the private sector to the table to play a role that it's supposed to play.
That's great, Minister. Thank you. And so, Ivan, I'll follow up with you. Obviously, I read your bio. Rio is a global company. You yourself have worked in Australia and Mongolia and other jurisdictions around the world. How do you think about this balance that the minister was talking about, right? And I mentioned in my question, obviously Rio Tinto wants to see very stable and strong regulation. You're very committed to ESG, but at the same time, you're also looking for some predictability. What's your assessment of Canada so far, and as you look at these questions?
Well, look, Robert, I'd start by saying up front, I've been in the country 6 months, so I'm very new and still learning a lot
Fresh
about
perspective.
Canada. But the first thing I would say, though, is look, there is a real tension. There's a dilemma here because the world needs minerals and metals and materials to decarbonise, to make that energy transition. And the demand is growing, and it's beyond the current mining and resources industry's ability to meet that expectation. So we do need to move, and we do need to find a pathway to service that demand, but we must do it more responsibly. Mining companies, natural resources companies are under more and more scrutiny, quite rightly, for the impacts that we create. And for me, it starts with, and this is experience I've gathered around the world, by engaging very closely with local communities and First Nations. That's where it begins, because the impacts are most intensely felt in those local jurisdictions where we operate. And if we partner early, and if we engage early, and we're very transparent with the developments we're looking to make, when we get into the regulatory processes, and we do that as effectively co-design and co-development with those local stakeholders and First Nations, my experience shows me that it's a smooth process. If there is a hurdle with government, we present that hurdle, we talk about it jointly, and my experience is we cut through it very quickly. If we misstep early with those local stakeholders and First Nations, it can get very difficult. And, for me, that's a responsibility mining, metals, natural resources companies need to take on early, and I think we are. We want to be seen as a preferred developer, someone who is responsible and can be relied on to do that early work and plan it well and manage the impacts which inevitably happen when you start mining. There is no such thing as sustainable mining, because we will disturb the ground, and that impact is something we need to manage through.
So, Minister, let me turn the question around then. The other direction, right? We talked about the private sector expectation of government. What does government expect from the private sector? Do you see opportunities, whether it's in critical minerals or the other areas you mentioned, for private sector to collaborate with government as you sort of look at the net zero agenda and Paris Agreement compliance? What do you see in the possibilities for closer cooperation with the private sector? What are your expectations?
Well, absolutely. I mean, look, government is not the fount of all knowledge, and the expertise that exists in the private sector in each of the different sectors is going to be deeper than what exists within government. In order to ensure that we actually have effective strategies, it is going to require active collaboration. I will tell you, critical minerals is certainly one of those. It was certainly one of the highest priority ones for the government of Canada. I would tell you that is something that I think is of interest to almost every province and territory in this country. But there are others around hydrogen, around biofuels, where we actually need collaboration to ensure that we are framing, the approach appropriately. That we've thought about the way in which you can actually ensure that private capital has the appropriate incentives to make the investment. That you are streamlining regulatory processes. That the federal government and provinces are playing a role in terms of ensuring needed infrastructure is put into place. And in many of these contexts, it's about trying to ensure that you're actually accelerating this through making it attractive for private capital to come into the market. And we talk about hydrogen and biofuels and critical minerals, but it goes all the way through to other things that we actually need to do in our economy to decarbonize, like buildings. I mean, 70% of the buildings that exist in this country today are going to have to be retrofitted. They're still going to be standing in 2050. Federal government doesn't have the money to be able to do all of that. We're going to have to find models through which we crowd in private capital. So we need to work together. We need to work with Indigenous peoples in many of these contexts, as Ivan said. We need to ensure that we're involving the labor movement in the conversation about workforce and skills. But it is going to require active collaboration. And that is exactly what I'm intending to do through the processes that I referenced in my speech, which is to launch a provincially focused process to align perspectives and ensure that we are actually doing everything that we possibly can between governments, with industry and with labor and Indigenous peoples to move forward expeditiously.
And where does the I want to talk about net zero a little bit, and I'll ask Ivan in a second as well. But Minister, where does the net zero advisory panel fit into that process? Is that the same thing, or is that sort of a part of it, or what should we expect there?
Yeah, I mean, the Net Zero Advisory Panel was appointed. In fact, I appointed them when I was in my previous role. So it was appointed to be an external body to provide independent advice to the government on pathways. And those pathways are around getting to the net zero place by 2050. We have tasked them at times with helping us with some earlier things like the oil and gas cap, which is more of an earlier term thing. But generally, the plan by and large to 2030 is fixed. There are some additional things that need to be done, but the climate plan that was produced about a year ago kind of sets out the major components of that. But beyond 2030, there's a lot of thinking to do about exactly how we make the steps and what are required from an investment and regulatory perspective to ensure that we get there. And what is a pathway, what is an appropriate pathway for the United Kingdom or Germany is almost certainly not the appropriate pathway for Canada. Canada needs to develop one that is customized and is most appropriate for the type of economy that we have, which is very different from most countries around the world. So the Net Zero Advisory Body is pulling on expertise outside of the government to help us to think our way through that.
Yeah, and I think a key theme of your speech really the idea that Canada does have a unique path as a natural resources producer, but also with so many different pathways: hydrogen, biofuels, critical minerals, clean electricity, multiple pathways towards net zero, and they're all important and on a regional basis. Ivan, when Rio Tinto thinks about net zero, right, and the timelines are similar, right? The uncertainty about new technologies after 2030. What does net zero mean for Rio Tinto sort of globally, and then what specifically about Canada? Where does your net zero strategy likely to unfold?
Okay, look, we made a very strong commitment just recently, late last year. We announced a review of our strategy and our commitment to climate and decarbonisation of our own operations, and that's the first focus to get that momentum. That's going to take a lot of investment, and we've allocated $7.5 billion towards that, and there's more that will sit behind that in PPAs and other agreements that we have for energy that we need to run our business. So there's a huge amount of work to do, and we don't have all the answers. We need to partner with government, with other players in industry to solve some of the challenges. So first and foremost, we need to decarbonise, and I'll come back to our aluminium business analysis. So some of it relies on really sophisticated changes in technology, and some of it is just hard work to run our business differently. That's part one. Part two is we need to also think about the Scope 3 emissions that we produce as a resource provider. So that's where we sell our product to customers and they process it further. Steel is the best example of this, and it generates enormous emissions. So helping them with technology and techniques to reduce emissions is also very important to us and something we're investing heavily in. And then, look, beyond that, I think then we bring a contribution towards the community, the country, in helping that path to net zero with the materials that we provide, and doing that in a way that we meet that demand to keep up with the huge energy transition that's underway. For me, Canada is in a very privileged position, and I think the Minister's speech called that out. And for me, it's a very exciting place to be with the position it has with natural resources. Of course, a lot of renewable energy, and a lot of that is firm, and that's unique. Hydropower is not something that everyone in the world is endowed with. And yes, okay, there's always more that you want, but if we use the hydropower energy across Canada wisely and mix that with other sources of non-emitting energy, Canada's in a wonderful position to both deal with its domestic needs as well as export and other growth options that really help build the economy. And, with our neighbour in the US needing to go through a lot of these challenges as well, there's huge opportunities here for Canada right on our doorstep, let alone looking further afield to Europe and Asia. So there's a lot of opportunity. I think Rio Tinto is very excited to have a presence here, to work closely with Canada, the communities across the different provinces that we operate in. And for me, that transition to net zero, that pathway, will be tough. It will be challenging, but that's exactly the kind of work that I think we can make a big contribution towards.
Well, Ivan, I want to come back to you on the ELYSIS project. I think that's quite relevant as an example of clean tech. And Minister, you mentioned the technology sector in your speech a couple times, and this really impressive fact about 13 companies on the Clean Tech 100 list, half of which are in BC. So great work there. And with your personal background in the private sector, you can appreciate this. How do you think about venture capital, right, in that sort of disruptive innovation side? Is that something the government's actively thinking about? And it is pretty competitive out there with the U.S. and Europe and Japan and others. How can the government support venture capital so we can get more great technologies like ELYSIS?
Is that for me or?
Minister, and then I'll follow up with Ivan.
Okay, all right. So I think it's a great question. I mean, Canada actually has historically been pretty good at early stage company or idea development, early stage company formation, getting companies to a certain size. And that's through a whole range of vehicles that we have, like the SHRED tax credits and the IRAP programs and Sustainable Development Technologies Canada and a whole range of those things. Where we've been criticized is taking those sort of reasonably small companies and actually helping them to commercialize and to scale. And of course, there's obviously a role for the company to play in that, but there is a role for government. And certainly in the past number of years, there has been a lot of concern about the lack of private capital, private venture capital in this country. A lot of money has come into the country from the United States, but it's always a hugely competitive thing when you don't have a lot of venture capital in the market itself. Business Development Bank of Canada has played a role for sure. But we're looking at how can you actually do a couple of things. The first is how can you crowd private sector capital earlier in the market? So bring more venture type funding from actors that wouldn't necessarily do venture capital. And so we're looking at some blended finance models where the government would take some of the risk to enable some of these folks to actually come back into the market in a way that they did in the early 2000s, but they left. And we're starting to see that some of that is happening even in the absence of government action. Like Hydrostore, a Toronto-based company, just got $250 million investment from Goldman Sachs. Not something that you would see every day. But we're certainly looking at blended finance. We're also looking at how can the government and how can we encourage large corporate players in Canada to be better early adopters of technology? Clean tech companies in Canada have historically complained that in order to actually deploy the first or the second, you had to go to the States or you had to go to Europe, that we never wanted to be first. We wanted to be fifth or fourth. I've had that personal experience myself a few times. And so we want to be better early adopters of technology because in order to commercialize being based here, you need to find a way to actually be an early adopter. So we're going to focus on that as well.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And so venture capital is one pathway, Ivan, but obviously big multinationals like Rio Tinto have your own technology development journeys. What was it like? Tell us about ELYSIS and what it took to build a project like that. First of all, describe it because not everybody will know what it is necessarily, but what was that big technological undertaking like for Rio Tinto?
Yeah, definitely. Look, the process of producing aluminium is a technology or a chemical process that's about 140 years old currently. It takes a lot of energy and carbon and a reduction process that builds or makes aluminium metal from alumina. It's a huge emitter of carbon because carbon's consumed in the process, the reduction process, and it's also very energy intensive. 20 years ago, Alcoa and Rio Tinto have been working on this challenge of how do you produce aluminium without carbon, without any greenhouse gas emissions. And it's a very, very difficult problem. Late last year, we cracked that problem. We solved it. And we have a cell running in Quebec, in the Saguenay right now, partnership with Alcoa. This is a project that's been done, and I think it's a fantastic example, partnership and support from the Canadian government, the Quebec government, and Apple. So it's quite a mixed group come together to solve this. We've got that first step done, and that's taken a huge amount of commitment and R&D from the team from both Alcoa and Rio Tinto. It's a joint venture we call ELYSIS. And now the challenge is, and I think it sort of builds on the minister's comments, is how do you turn that into something practical that makes a difference in the world? So it's good that we've got that first piece of the puzzle, but we now need to scale it. And we're talking about multi-billion-dollar investments to actually translate this into scale impact production of zero carbon aluminium. And it's a really good story of saying, look, we can see these technologies being developed in Canada. We now need to translate them, leverage Canada's strengths around the production of aluminium, and see that all the way through. Rio Tinto is also looking at the production of zero carbon or very, very low carbon steel or iron as well. And again, this is technology that a number of different parties around the world are looking at. It's difficult. There's lots and lots of issues and challenges, but it's a sort of commitment that we're making. And I think there's a number of companies that are coming to bear now saying, look, we need to get involved in this work early. We can't wait for that to happen. We're not just going to be a mining company that picks up existing technology and applies that in our operations. We need to be at the forefront of that and help solve some of these challenges, but do that in a way that partners with governments like, in this case, in Canada, and other local businesses that can help us solve those problems. In the case of green iron or green steel, it's going to probably draw on a lot of hydrogen, because you still need some sort of reductant, albeit a green reductant. And so, again, there's another partnership there. And all of a sudden, we start to see real offtake and real demand for hydrogen, which helps that industry to build. And the more these networks or clusters of activity start to tie off each other, I think the more sustainable they become and more economically credible they become to get the momentum that we're looking for a decade from now.
Yeah, that's a great overview. And I'm just looking at some of the questions from the audience. I'd like to go to a couple of these questions for you guys. One audience member is asking about BC specifically, Minister, which is your backyard, of course, and the main focus of the forum here. I like this question about ESG, Indigenous, and engaging communities. What are the opportunities in BC? Obviously, we've been through Trans Mountain. We've been through other major project developments in like LNG Canada. Can BC be a leader on really looking at ESG and Indigenous, not as a weakness, but as you said in your speech, but as a real strength for Canada, right? To really build strong partnerships that can attract resource investment and create the jobs of the future. What do you see in BC specifically on that question?
Well, I mean, with respect to the question around Indigenous peoples, BC is obviously a little bit unique in the Canadian context, in the sense that very few treaties were ever signed here. And so the whole legal framework is a little bit different than the rest of the country. And for that reason, I think the government of British Columbia and the federal government have spent a lot of time trying to think about how to engage in a fulsome way in the discussions with Indigenous peoples across the board. This government has focused a lot on addressing some of the critical social and infrastructure challenges facing many First Nations communities, and there still is obviously lots of work to do. I think one of the great, the key things that we need to push forward on is what I would call the economic side of reconciliation, which is actually ensuring that economic foundations are built for Indigenous communities by partnering in the context of the kinds of projects that we're talking about. One of the things in the mandate letter that you referred to that I have been charged with is to develop a national benefit sharing framework, which is exactly on that point. And certainly some of the things we're thinking about, for example, in the context of critical minerals, is how do we actually enable Indigenous communities to partner early on with mining companies in their traditional territories in a way that's meaningful for them from an economic perspective. And there's certainly lots of thinking to do and lots of conversations to be had. But I think that here in British Columbia, in this province, this provincial government, I think, has been a leader with respect to working with Indigenous peoples in this country. They were the first ones to have adopted UNDRIP before even the federal government, well, our federal government did. I think there's an enormous opportunity for us to work to get this right.
Yeah, and I think that really could play to Canada's strengths in ESG, both the E and the S, the social, having a strong social compact, including Indigenous people, will be, a great credential for Canada competing for capital globally. There are a couple questions from the audience about carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So, Minister, I'd love to hear the latest from NRCan and the government on that, and then Ivan, from you as well, about where you possibly see carbon capture fitting in for Rio Tinto. So, Minister, first of all, what is the latest from the federal government on carbon capture?
So carbon capture, it's important, I think, just to distinguish, there's kind of two different ways to think about carbon capture. There is carbon capture, for example, from flue gas streams where you're sequestering the carbon in the ground. And then there are what are referred to as negative emissions technologies like direct air capture, like what carbon engineering is attempting to do in Squamish, where you're essentially pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere for the purpose of either sequestering it or making zero carbon liquid fuels out of it. We are a big booster of both. I think the world is going to need negative emissions technologies for sure as we move towards net zero. But in terms of CCUS, that you would take flue gas streams, it's incredibly important going forward for us. It's incredibly important to reduce the carbon intensity of the fuels that we're using as we transition towards a net zero future. It's extremely important for us in the context of some of the products that offer opportunity in the future. So you can derive hydrogen from electrolysis. You can also derive it from natural gas. But you can only derive it from natural gas in the context of a low carbon future if you're capturing all of the carbon and you are sequestering it. That's an opportunity for an Alberta or a Saskatchewan, in the same way that electrolysis driven hydrogen is an opportunity for Quebec and Manitoba. So we see it as an important component. It is not a silver bullet. Carbon capture and sequestration is not a climate plan. Anybody who tells you it is wrong. But it is an important component of a climate plan that seeks to reduce emissions and promote economic opportunity across all sectors of the economy.
And Ivan, how about you? Is that something Rio Tinto's thinking about in Canada or globally?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the minister covered it extremely well. I would support everything he said. We need to be extremely pragmatic about this transition, and CCS is absolutely part of it. Helping us with that transition, it's going to be a critical lever to pull for a variety of needs. There will be parts of our operations processing where it's very hard to abate. And, that then provides an opportunity. Now, we've partnered with a company in Iceland who have figured out how to store carbon as stone, effectively mineralise it permanently. I went and visited the team, some research, about 7 years of work. They converted from effectively a university work into the field in, a real life example. It's fantastic. Now, there's a lot more work required to bring this to bear, but people are making real progress, and I think it's so important that we count on this as part of the solution. As the minister said, it's not the answer in itself. It isn't a climate plan, but it's a key lever we need to pull. And look, it's our backup. If we would have failed with ELYSIS, we would have turned towards CCS on aluminium as a backup. Well, we've got to get the carbon controlled and managed, and first prize is get it out of the process altogether. Second prize is capture it and store it in a safe and meaningful way. And we see both as part of the answer.
Yeah, well, personally, I find all of this very exciting. Call me a natural resources nerd, maybe I am, but I really enjoy the conversation. I really like the minister's speech, and I think it is important to engage Canadians and get them excited about the possibilities here, about sustaining our excellence in natural resources, but evolving to this net zero world. And I think both of you are working on that in different ways. It sort of leads me to a final discussion point around labor and workforce, right? This question of, you mentioned a possible labor shortage, Minister Wilkinson. Other people are worried about, maybe redundancies in extractive industries that maybe don't transition as well from a skills perspective. I'd like to ask both of you, starting with you, Minister, a little bit more thought on the workforce development and, what the federal government can do, especially with younger people, to get them excited in the way that I am, as somebody who spent my whole career in natural resources, and, compete for talent. Not just with other countries, but versus the financial sector or technology, healthcare. How do we get people excited about the things we're talking about today, especially younger people, for the workforce of the future?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And there's been a lot of conversation around some of these issues, often framed in the context of the just transition. I sometimes I worry a little bit about that phrase, not because I don't support the principles, but I think on the prairies in particular, that is not understood in the same way. It's kind of my $100,000 a year job working on the rig, and you're going to train me to do something that it's going to pay me a quarter or a third of what I was making before. I don't think that's what's meant, but I think that's how it's interpreted. And so what I would say is it's important from my perspective not to have this conversation about the labor force in a vacuum. You've actually got to look first at what are the jobs that you're actually looking to create? Where do you think those opportunities are? And how are you going to enable them so that you can actually have a conversation about what needs to be transitioned and how and when? And so that's exactly what the process that we're going to be launching is about, is identifying and mapping out those processes or those opportunity sets to be able to actually ensure that we understand how we need to transition going forward. As I said, my view is there's more opportunity for Canada going forward than there is workforce. The issue is going to be if there are certain kinds of work that changes, that we are providing the appropriate supports for workers, families, and communities to actually make those transitions. And in terms of young people, I will tell you that if you start talking about natural resources in the context of sustainability, you're going to find young people who want to come there. I came out of the clean tech sector, but it was all industrial technology. We worked on hydrogen, and our partners were Shell and others. We worked in the mining space on remediating water so that you could put it back safely into water courses. And most of the engineers that came to work with us were 25 or 30 years old because they wanted more in their life than just a paycheck. They wanted to feel like they were actually doing something that was important from an environmental perspective. So if we think about resources in the context of sustainability, the young people will come.
So, Ivan, is that the experience at Rio Tinto as well? You mentioned aluminum as a 140-year-old technology, right? I mean, I'm excited personally. Maybe how is that going for the younger workforce for you guys? Can you position Rio Tinto as a problem solver, right, contributing to dealing with climate change and creating these sustainable jobs of the future? What's the view from Rio Tinto on that question?
No, I think again the minister's coined it perfectly. That's exactly the reaction we see from our workforce, and old or young, to be honest. People want to turn up for work to make a difference, to contribute to solving what is one of the world's most complex and challenging problems. And Rio Tinto is in a great place, as are many other companies in Canada here to be part of that solution. And I think that really does draw as a really important card for people to get excited about those jobs. To the minister's other comments, look, work will change in some cases, and that's okay. It's changed anyway with technology and automation and so on. I did a presentation a few years back and talked about sheep shearing, and the notion that we used to shear sheep with a pair of manual shears, and now it's not far off being done by robots. That's just life, and the change and the energy transition, decarbonisation will bring more of that. What we've got to do is communicate that effectively and help reduce some of the anxiety and unease around it. On ELYSIS, and I'll use that as a practical example, we get some of that concern because some of our team work on in the plant that produces the carbon blocks that we use to make aluminium. So they're saying, well, if you don't need carbon anymore, then what happens to me? Well, guess what? We still need electrodes. They just look different. They're made differently. They actually require a different set of technology, but we still need some really important skills to do that. So we need to help people understand that, understand what the transition is, and support them through that shift. I guess I'd make one other comment. In this broader transition, I think we've got to also just communicate more about this energy transition and decarbonisation, because there is sort of two sides that take part in the discussion, and there's still some people that are quite anxious and sceptical about the whole thing, and they're worried that they're not going to be included. And I really don't see that personally. So to me, that means we've got to open up that conversation more and understand what are the impacts for the average mum and dad at home, what are the impacts for university students and other trades coming through in their education, and really tell that story so they can get excited about where they want to play in that transition, and help them understand that Canada is actually extremely privileged in all of this. I mean, of the economies and the countries I've worked around the world, Canada's as well positioned as almost anywhere you could pick. And so we want the people to understand that and then target their interests to be part of the economy and part of that transition in a place they're most passionate about.
Yeah, I think passion is a great way to think about it. And I think that, both of you have done a great job laying out the different pathways and possibilities, whether it's by region and province, by sector, large companies and small companies, technology-based, resource-based. there's really something for everybody, I think, in this story here from a workforce perspective. And I think the BC Natural Resources Forum does a great job of showcasing all those different possibilities for everyone to get excited about, whether workers, students, or investors, or and so forth. So, thank you very much, Ivan, for telling us the story of Rio Tinto Aluminum and Rio Tinto Canada. Mr. Wilkinson, thank you for all your great work on behalf of the country, and best of luck to you and your government. And I will thank everyone in the audience for submitting questions, and look forward to hopefully doing this again next year. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, Ivan, and Minister Wilkinson for your participation in our session this afternoon. Well, that brings day 2 of the 19th Annual BC Natural Resources Forum to a close. We greatly appreciate the support and participation from everyone.